Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be here with you all. I'm Zane. Good afternoon. I'm excited to present on my capstone of pathways to a smarter future. SMRs, or small modular reactors, and this is not the only time you'll see a pun within this presentation. So apologies to start. So this capstone focused primarily on evaluating the impacts of both policy and market conditions on the development, deployment, and diffusion of advanced nuclear reactors in the United States. And so the motivation for this project and why I was interested in advanced nuclear is because I'm not sure if you all have realized recently, but we are in a pretty interesting energy moment, and that's to put it lightly. Obviously, with the Strait of Hormuz being closed, all the headlines about data centers and electricity rates, we need rapidly to expand our energy access and portfolio, while at the same time decarbonizing the energy sector. And you see some statistics up there. In the next 10 years, we need about 40% more energy globally, while also decarbonizing the energy sector by about 55% to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So within this project, I was looking at advanced nuclear as a potential solution for that. And why advanced nuclear? Well, nuclear is historically safe, efficient, and clean. And when I say safe, usually those two things don't always go hand in hand in everyone's mind. I don't know if that's the right metaphor there. But as you can see on the graph, nuclear is historically much safer than the vast majority of generation resources and almost the entirety of fossil-driven generation resources. On par with solar and wind, nuclear only accounts for 0.03% of fatalities per terawatt hour of electricity produced. And that's even accounting for, as we think of the large nuclear emergencies, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl. Obviously, nuclear is a high consequence generation technology, so regulation needs to be strong and efficient, but it is historically much safer than the other alternatives. Additionally, nuclear has, one thing that's not covered in the study that is a real challenge that will continue to be worked on and solved in many ways is the radioactive waste piece of it as well. Next, nuclear is efficient. And that's really the value proposition of nuclear at large. So nuclear is about 1 to 3 times more energy dense. A nuclear reaction is 1 to 3 million times more energy dense than chemical reactions driven by fossil fuel plants. As you can see here, 1 pellet of uranium fuel, which is essentially the size of your fingerprint, has as much energy potential as 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas, 149 gallons of oil, and 1 ton of coal. And finally, nuclear energy is green. And while we don't think of, while uranium, the main component of nuclear fuel, is not a renewable resource like wind or solar, it is a carbon-free generation technology, and the life cycle carbon emissions of nuclear are on par with or lower than typical renewable resources like wind and solar. Okay, so we talked about the value proposition for nuclear at large. Now let's talk about SMR specifically, which is a subsect of advanced nuclear technologies. So here we have a summary. All right, so what is an SMR, or small modular reactor? It's all in the name. You've got the diagram there, and you can see they're not that small comparatively, but comparative to large nuclear reactors, they are much, much smaller. Large nuclear reactors power about 1 billion, large nuclear reactors provide about 3 times as much power as small nuclear reactors. Small nuclear reactors typically classified between 1 and 300 megawatts. They're modular, so the majority of the reactor components are designed to be built off-site in factory manufacturing processes and then assembled on-site. And then finally, like I said, they are reactors. They are fission reactors, and they use various degrees and types of nuclear technologies, from traditional technologies that we see in the standard nuclear fleet, which is light water reactors, the main premise of my presentation today, to advanced reactor technologies that have different use cases and technical components. All right, so what are the main competitive advantages of SMRs? Mainly, they're on the cost and scheduling reduction side. So like I said, they're traditionally smaller than typical nuclear reactors, traditional nuclear reactors, and they are built primarily off-site. That leads to quicker manufacturing, as well as less component parts that need to go into these reactors, leading to cost declines, scheduling declines. And then additionally, because of their size and footprint, they can be sited in various different locations that traditional nuclear reactors are unable to be placed. The main bet of SMRs as compared to legacy nuclear technologies is that the economies of multiple will trump the economies of scale. And so essentially the way we currently build nuclear is as big as we can go and cranking it as much as it can over the life cycle of that plant. That is not the operating procedure of an SMR, and we are sacrificing the size of the plant for the ease of manufacturing and the amount that can be manufactured off-site and then assembled on premises. So the main research question that I dived into are what factors on the market side and the policy side will influence the development, deployment, and diffusion of SMRs, and that approach took 3 distinct steps that led to 3 distinct analyses. The first one was on development. Development focused primarily on the policy environment that would support initial development and deployment of SMR technology. Think of that as first-of-a-kind technologies, so proving the technology initially, and then getting to the first 10 or so units deployed in the real world. Next, I did a deployment analysis, essentially developing a parametric model that would look at the different policy and economic factors that would support essentially deployment and cost reductions of SMRs going forward. And then finally, based off those cost reductions, looking at how SMRs could potentially diffuse in markets throughout the US. So working through each of those components specifically, I'll talk first about development factors. On the development side, the main driver of development, so proving a technology initially and getting to the first 10 deployments of it, is policy. And the main goals of policy are 5-fold. It's to prove the technology initially, so get to a first-of-a-kind technology. It is to de-risk and finance initial deployments, so getting to the first 10 or so risky deployments. And then finally, is to achieve scale and then enable a supporting ecosystem. There are 3 different types or specific types of policies that support this. You've got direct fiscal investment. It makes sense. It's the government spending money on a thing directly. You've got fiscal incentive, so think of that as subsidies or taxes to support competitiveness going forward. And then also you've got regulatory reform, which is what it sounds like, making it easier to build and site these things. This is a policy matrix that looks at specific policy interventions that have been used throughout the world to support advanced technology development and deployment. You can see on the x-axis, we've got deployment support, on the y-axis, development support. Most of the direct federal investment support initial development and deployment, while the other set of policies support deployment and ecosystem generation. Of note, in the past 2 administrations, the US has worked to support, to enable all of these policies minus one. At this time in the program, you probably know which one that is, and that is carbon pricing or carbon taxes. Historically, we do not like additional taxation in this country. All right, so the next stage of my review and my analysis was looking at a state-level overview of what the policy environment looked like. I did this by scoring different policies on a range of criteria, nuclear policies specifically, as well as current operating reactors, historic operating reactors within different states, and then recent nuclear plant closures throughout the US if they were driven by political means. As you can see, it's a much more diversified policy environment within the states, with several states that are pro-nuclear having active reactors and active development of SMR technology, and then a handful of states that are hostile to anti-nuclear themselves. Importantly, the main policies that lead to a hostile environment within states are an outright ban of new nuclear development, which we have in Minnesota. Additionally, you've got essentially effective bans that are contingent on the waste problem being solved at the federal level, which we have in California, Oregon, and Maine. And then also, you have another subsect of policies that is dependent on legislative or voter approval for new nuclear development. All right, so we talked about initial development factors, and now we'll talk about deployment factors. And essentially, the key questions of this analysis we're looking at what specific economic and policy factors would support the deployment and cost reductions after the first 5 to 10 SMRs were live. The way I did this is I built out a parametric model, and to inform that model, I used different markets as well as different market factors. It's important to understand part of the value proposition of SMRs are the different markets that it can approach and the use cases that it has as compared to legacy nuclear or additional generation. When it comes to electricity generation, that's relatively straightforward, but one thing that is key with SMRs and nuclear at large is it provides firm baseload energy, which most renewable carbon-free sources do not, and it does so in a way that is much more geographically open, less limited geographically, which is the case for hydro and advanced geothermal. Next, you've got industrial process heat. One key component of next-generation nuclear reactors is they operate at higher temperatures, and those higher temperatures can be used to support industrial processes, which are historically hard to decarbonize sectors. Next is load following. If you have a high penetration of renewable resources on the grid that are dependent on geographic or geological or climatological features, you'll have a lot of variability in your electricity load throughout the day, throughout the season, throughout the years. And so SMRs can help really balance that load in a carbon-free factor, in a carbon-free manner that other renewable resources or carbon-free resources cannot. And the bottom three here are different subsets of market segments that SMRs can approach or that they can deploy into. Behind the meter can support large load entities like data centers, which is hot right now, as well as industrial facilities, and then microreactors and microgrid or off-grid resources help for very specific use cases like emergency response or off-grid communities. This is a very busy slide. I'm not going to ask you to digest all of it, but essentially these are the main parameters of my parametric economics, and policy model. There's three parameter types: design, economic, and policy. And then anything that you see with a range and a base case was essentially used to set up the bounds of the model themselves and look at a range of different scenarios based off of different economic policy conditions. I'll draw your attention to three specific ones here. The ones at the top were important for informing cost reduction models for overnight capital costs, and then these two right here were critical to inform the levelized cost of energy models that I use in the economic analysis. All right, so overnight cost of capital, or OCC, it looks at how much a plant would cost to develop and deploy if it happened overnight. So it's essentially just the baseline cost for development. It doesn't take in financing fees, doesn't take in construction fees or time in construction, and it's important to understand how capital intensive these are compared to other generational resources. As you can see, so the base case is the line in the middle, the range is depicted by the swath, and as you can expect, or we could expect based off my assumptions, around a $3,000 cost of overnight capital or overnight capital cost from the first deployment to the 100th deployment, and this is very dependent on supportive policy and market environments. One thing that's important to contextualize this is currently where solar and wind and combined cycle natural gas sit. So solar and wind are the most competitive renewable resources, and then combined cycle natural gas is the most competitive thermal resource at this time. And so it takes about between 30 and 40 deployments of SMRs for them to become competitive with other resources, especially in the renewable space. This isn't as important as the levelized cost of energy, which we'll go to now, but is an input into this model and helps understand the financial or potential risks associated with financing large capital projects. This is for levelized cost of energy, LCOE. What LCOE tells you is essentially how much you need to recoup in costs to make it worthwhile to produce energy from this resource. And you can see there's a very large margin of LCOE for nuclear right now, and it's very dependent on a supportive policy, mainly environment and learning rates. This is where nuclear, advanced nuclear SMRs become competitive with other generational resources. One thing that's important to note is solar and wind are some of the lowest LCOE, but it doesn't always capture the variability of these resources, and it takes about 10 deployments in the base case, but in the worst case scenario, it never becomes competitive with other generational resources. One thing that's important, and again, like I said, what we don't have in this country is carbon taxes. If you combine a $50 carbon tax on top of the policy packages to support nuclear, it is almost immediately cost competitive with combined cycle natural gas, which is the most effective of the thermal generation resources. And if we look at deployments specifically, like I said, it becomes almost immediately effective or cost competitive with combined cycle natural gas, and then also within the first 8 to 20 deployments, competitive with other generation technologies. Where does that put us within the growth rate, or what does that put us within deployments, expected deployments within the states? Right about there. And this is the IEA's announced pledges for SMR deployments. The United States is the blue line at the bottom. So by 2035, we should have a good indication as to whether or not these technologies are in fact becoming cost competitive with other generation technologies. All right, so we set up what is going to help with development, what's going to help with deployment, and finally, how will these diffuse? I'm going to walk through very quickly several inputs to a model I made in the geospatial diffusion model in QGIS, which is a GIS platform, and essentially takes all that information and then tries to depict where they diffuse depending on different feasibility and viability cases. I'm not going to walk through this one by one, but essentially this is measuring how feasible SMRs are based off geographic, operational, and infrastructure requirements. It's going to be a bit of a busy map here, but this shows you where can you put an SMR. Not where should you build an SMR or where would you like to build an SMR, but based off of just geographic factors and regulatory and siting guidance, where can you put it? Essentially, nowhere with a lot of people or with a big slope or unlimited water. Next, this is a policy layer that has been integrated on top of that, and this is where can you put an SMR, not just with geography, but also political economy. This is going to be a very busy map because I love busy maps, but essentially, again, this is all part of a model that you can build out and use and can be tailored to users, and this is looking at not only where can you put an SMR, but what sites can you select. You've got your site list on the left. Those can be toggled on and off based off user expectations and user criteria. And then finally, you've got where can you put these things, you've got specific sites that you can use, and then where should you put it, it's based off the viability. Two viability models I looked at were electricity prices and carbon intensity as different ways to cite these things. When it comes to electricity prices, again, another busy map, this is taking all the inputs previously. The one thing I'd like to point out is SMRs become cost competitive with most generational resources fairly quickly in the first 20 deployments. So that's the majority of the map right there is covered by that based off the previous analyses. And then when it comes to carbon intensity, there are several, the diffusion would look differently, but it would be focused primarily on the Midwest and the South, where you have a large portion of coal generation within the United States. All right, so when it comes to the pathways of a smarter future, some of the big key findings is that it'll be very dependent on supportive policy in the development and initial deployment phases of SMRs, and that learning are going to be critical. Learning is going to be contingent, again, on being able to manufacture most of these components off-site and then assemble them on-site. And then SMRs can become cost competitive based off my analyses within the first 10 deployments without carbon taxes and almost immediately with carbon taxes. Limitations, this is a very immature and complex technological space and regulatory space. It's really hard to put in all the different factors. Additionally, political considerations and political, supply chain, and radioactive waste disposal considerations were not included in the analysis. And then finally, acknowledgements here. First, I'd like to acknowledge, I'd like to thank my capstone committee, my chair Ryan Hanna, Shani Chowdhury, and Dr. Josh Graff-Zivin. I'd like to acknowledge my beautiful wife, my family and friends that came from near and far to support me on this. None of this would have been possible without your support and love. Then finally, the CSP crew, my cohort, my colleagues, Corey and Jada, and everyone else that made this possible. It's been a hell of a year. Thanks. Probably have time for one question? No. One question, all right. Yes.
So Zane Heather, of those states that are possibly green because they're looking at this, are any states showing in their legislation? Did you come across any states that are actually actively looking at employing these?
Yeah, any state that has, we're going to get way back here, that is bright green in the policy analysis has some sort of supportive SMR legislation that's out, and several pilot projects have already been started in those specific states. Namely, Tennessee, Utah, and Idaho are the most forward-moving in this space. All right, thank you, everybody.
Wait, one more. Zane, one more? Well, I guess I won't ask him a question, but I want to commend him on his excellent taste in fashion, particularly the herringbone blazer. Your father must be very proud.